Welcome, everyone. I'm so glad to have you here today. Today is Friday, and so it's actually the first Friday in August, and we're so glad to be able to join you today. It's my privilege to be your hostess, talking about subject matter that are important to us. And we bring in experts that can share thoughts, feelings, and are on the front line of what we do as business people, as entrepreneurs, as educators. And so glad to have you. If you are, as you join us, please put in your name and where you're from so that each of you can see who's here. And you can also help me welcome my guests for today. I'm very pleased to have Dr. Aviva Legatt here as my guest. She is the author of Get Real and Get In by St. Martin's Press, and she's also an Ivy League admissions expert. We were just talking, I've known her since 2015, 2016, we had met. And so I've been watching her grow and build her practice over those years. So welcome, Aviva.
Thank you so much for having me, Cyndy. It's great to be here with you and with all your listeners as well. I've enjoyed watching your transition as well, from all the different business ventures you've done to having this consultancy and this forum. So I'm really privileged to be here.
Well, we're glad to have you. And as you can see, we've got people coming in from all over. We have well over 200 people registered for today's session. So obviously, this is a topic that is really important to us as counselors and as advisors, and working with our students to help them find their authentic self and to really share their story. So as we get started, tell us a little bit about your story and how you got into counseling students to go to college.
Thanks, Cyndy. So really relates, my whole personal journey really relates to my book as well. So when I was a kid in high school, I was a stressed out overachiever, so to speak. And I was in a very affluent area, but I was not from that area. So I was not savvy like my peers. I did not have the same, as I later learned, cultural capital as my surrounding peers. So I ended up putting a lot of pressure on myself with this college process, and my parents didn't have a lot of money, so it's not like they paid for me to have like tutors or counselors, but I did have the benefit, obviously, of being in this high achieving environment. So anyway, before I put in my application, I just decided as a sophomore, I said I want to go to NYU, and I just put all of my energy behind that from sophomore year through application process. And right before applications were due, I ended up getting pneumonia, which I don't recommend for anybody applying to college. It's not something good to have happen on top of the process itself. But more importantly than the stress of it, that was the positive trigger, so to speak, of really figuring out later in life that process was quite transformative for me as a person. It helped me focus more on setting goals, helped me figure out who I was, what I wanted to do. By deep diving into NYU and all the things I did to try to get in there, I was able to learn about, what would the opportunities be like for me as an adult? How could I sort of create my own future? And so that process just stuck with me even throughout college. When I studied, I did end up getting into NYU, but that wasn't really necessarily the point, right? I studied music business at NYU. And when I was at NYU, the music business was changing from the physical kind of CDs to the digital format. So there was a lot of upheaval in that. And when I was a freshman at NYU, 9/11 happened. So that was also quite an unsettling way to start college, especially given how close NYU is to the Twin Towers. So I realized, I would say pretty quickly at NYU that, I wasn't sure the music business was for me. I also got really involved in my school activities, and I was like, oh, you can have a career that relates to admissions or something in college. So I ultimately decided to pursue that. And that was what brought me to Penn, where I got my master's and doctorate in the field of higher education. And most recently, in a full-time capacity, I was Senior Associate Director of Admissions for Wharton, where I sat on freshman and transfer committees and oversaw pre-college programs. And so when I was finishing up my doctorate, I had kind of a fork in the road. I could have stayed at Penn for longer and, done the full-time work there, or I could try something different. And I had this, really, transformative and difficult experience I had in high school, but it really had stuck with me all those years later. And I had really wanted to do something with admissions. So I just decided to take the leap at that point and try my hand at consulting. And I've been doing that since 2014. And, since that time, I've, had the great fortune of working with students from all over the world who want to come to the US for higher education, who want to go for the top tier colleges because they see these colleges as kind of a means to better themselves, to increase their opportunities. And I think that's why that part of it has really resonated with me. And, ultimately I wrote my book, Get Real and Get In, to sort of bring full circle my own experiences as an applicant. I interviewed a lot of different thought leaders in the book because our college journeys are deeply personal journeys, but nobody necessarily shares them in a conversation. They might share like how they met their husband or wife or why they moved from one location to another, but people don't really talk about their college journeys. So I thought it would be really interesting to hear what other people's experiences was like and to share those and to share lessons from those to help students figure out who they are, what they want on the road to application, not necessarily just to get into their top college, but to really get what they want out of life. So that's really the point of the book. And that's why my journey has inspired the book.
Well, that's very interesting. It reminds me of Road Trip Nation. Are you familiar with them? They were a group of, this is many years ago, where they were graduating from college and trying to figure out, well, what am I going to do next? So they started talking to business CEOs and people to see what their journeys were. And I think you're right. I think that's something that often is not discussed, is very individual, and can be very impactful, as you said. So one of the things, so Barbara, you already see people have said, great book.
So the book is called Get Real and Get In. I saw somebody ask what it's called. So this is the book, Get Real and Get In, with St. Martin's Press, just in case you want to take a look.
And it just came out, last week?
It just came out on Tuesday, so 3 days ago.
Yay. So in your book, and I was privileged to get an advanced copy, you talk about the impressiveness paradox. Can you explain what that is?
Sure. And so I think that this is a paradox that we all kind of intuitively know in our own social circles and our own lives, which is essentially if you're trying to be like other people and make a good impression and to impress others based on that, you're actually going to come off as kind of fake and not super impressive at all. And so the point of putting that paradox in the book is to say that, as a young person, you might see somebody who goes to college you want to go and feel compelled to emulate what they did in some way so that you can in theory position yourself to have the same outcome. But that's actually a faulty logic in my view, and that actually what students should do is to really dive into what makes them tick and what makes them happy, and then coincidentally, once they dive deeply into that and fully express it, they will be very attractive candidates to top colleges. So I wanted to highlight that as a way to help people see that, this is not working for you. And, why don't you figure out something that actually will work for you?
Well, and I think that's a very good point to bring home for families and students, because they do, teenagers will ask, well, what do I need to put on here? Like what will impress them on my resume and things like that. And your whole message is don't worry about that, And so how do you recommend that students really, explore their authentic selves? How do they do that? What does that look like? What does that feel like?
Right. Well, of course, it's a very individual journey, as my book highlights, of the different stories. I do have a framework that I like to bring forward. It's not in the book. It's something that I thought of afterwards. But I think for every person, they have what I call the college admissions X factor. So this stands for experience, expertise, and exponentialism. And the first level is experience. So this is, every student has something that they're interested in. Whether it's something that's more, daily, like reading, or something a little bit quirky, like a niche hobby. So everybody has something that they like to do, that they would do regardless of college applications. So they have some experience in that, they gain exposure to something. Then the next level is expertise. So that's when you would go deeper into a subject matter, whether that's an academic subject matter or something of personal interest, to really hone in some kind of key insight that you can share with others. Then finally, the third level is exponentialism. And so that's what I would ideally like to see every student achieve before they apply to college, would be to find something that they not only are become expert at, but also something that they can give back to others in some way. Whether that's, if they love to read and write, they could write a book and they could publish that. Or if they love researching a certain topic, they could work with a professor and then look to publish that research, or spin off a blog from that, or start an organization, or connect an organization they're part of to other organizations. So the idea is that whatever you do by the end of high school, you ideally want to make your school, your community, or your family even a better place than when than if you were not there. And so if every student can go on that journey of finding out, what is that X factor and how do I best express it, that's a way to be an authentic and not cookie cutter applicant when you do apply to college.
I love that. I love the imagery of the X factor and having those three different components. So it sounds like, is that something students should be doing like as they enter in high school, or is that something they can do, at the end of their junior year? What do you see as a timeline for that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I don't think it's ever too late to continue to recenter and hone in on who we are and what we want to do. And I think the X Factor framework is a way to really think about that in a concrete way. I think the exploration or the experience piece really could happen anytime. It could happen later on in high school, it could happen earlier. The hope is that as a student is in high school, they could continue to deepen and deepen and deepen until they can achieve that exponentialism. That said, let's say you have a senior who never heard about this, doesn't know that this is a good way to prepare for college, and they're applying today. There are ways ideally that the student has contributed, has made a difference. And so it's a matter of looking at what the college is looking for and trying to, not kind of rewrite the narrative around what was done, but really understand your audience that you're presenting yourself to. And that you're presenting a side of yourself that the colleges will really value. So in my book, I talk about a framework for students to understand the college's priorities and what they want to, what they're looking for, so that you can apply this framework to, any college that you want to research. And if you'd like, I can go into what the framework is, if that would be helpful.
Sure. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. So it's a number of questions I ask, and this isn't verbatim from the book, but the essence of the question is, one, what is the school's motto or mission statement? And so this gives you, the applicant, a sense of what is the culture like? What are some of the overall values of this college? And how do these values resonate with me? So that's one way to assess your fit. The second is looking at the university strategic plan. And granted, this is usually a very boring and dry document that all universities put out, but it's basically a document that says that here are the 4 or 5 things that we're prioritizing in the coming 5 to 7 years. And this is what we're looking to grow and build. And so if I'm an applicant, I can look at the strategic plan and be like, oh, they're looking to grow and build entrepreneurship. I'm an entrepreneur. Maybe I should consider this college because they're looking to build on that. So they're going to be looking for students like me. So, admissions offices are essentially tasked with supporting president's agendas and dean's agendas. And so if you know what those agendas are, you can better articulate the right kinds of experiences that the colleges are looking for. Versus if you don't think about it at all, you're just looking at the rankings or the brand name or the location, you're not going to get that degree of nuance. So you find a priority that fits you, and then you try to research all the different resources related to that at the college. The other thing is you can check out the donations that people are making to colleges. The colleges will release, they have press releases. They'll talk about, we got this, $30 million donation to fund this center or something like that. So if there's a topic of interest, you can look at that, a specific university you're looking at, or if you just want to know, hey, what universities have, like, let's say biotechnology, what universities are investing in biotechnology? You can go to a website called the Chronicle of Philanthropy. You can type in biotechnology, and then you can pull up where donations have gone. Now, granted, not all those donations have gone to universities, but a lot of times they have, and you can find the research labs, let's say, that are receiving a lot of funding that might be larger or more interesting for you to look at. So yeah, I'm really, in this book, I'm just encouraging students to just become college insiders and express themselves authentically according to what they know the college is looking for. Because if you talk to somebody and you have no idea who they are, what they're thinking, your message may not be very effective. But if you know who you're talking to, you're going to really hone in on the things that they value most so that you can show your most valuable assets to the college.
I think what you're talking about sounds to me like almost a flipping of the whole college application process, right? Instead of saying, okay, what do I have to bring to 10, 12 colleges? Well, what colleges are out there, and how can I meet what their needs are? And that will make me a much more viable candidate if I know what their needs are, and I can say, here's how I'm going to fit those. It's like applying for a job, right? You research the company, you see where their needs are, you see where their mission is, and then you try to hone your application to say, I understand your mission, I share it, here's where your needs are, and here's how I fit it.
Exactly. And another piece of this that I haven't mentioned yet is I am a big advocate of students networking. And so, this you just gave the job example. If you know somebody at a company and you're applying for a job, you're going to be more likely to get the job if somebody knows you at the company than if you're just a random applicant applying out of thousands of applicants on the website. So it behooves you to get to know people at the university, at the very least, to personalize those supplement essays. And at the very best, to have somebody actually know who you are when you apply. Because in my experience, when you're on the admissions committee and somebody knows the applicant, it's not just a quick yes or no. It's if we let them in, should we do this or should we not do that? And it's actually, you get a more thorough and thoughtful review if somebody actually knows who you are versus somebody who doesn't know who you are. So huge advice I give to students is not necessarily to, you're not networking to get a lot of recommendation, but you're networking to really get that personalized insight about how this college fits you, what kind of, where would you actually go if you were to be a student there? And it could be a religious resource, it could be a cultural resource, it could be an academic department that you connect to. So what are the things you would actually do as a student there? And then how can you learn about those things to really understand if you would enjoy the experience of going to this college or not?
Well, and that brings up the whole topic of transition too, is what are you going to do when you get there, and how are you going to connect? Harlan Cohen talks about that too as an author, and he talks about the 3 Ps that students have to have, look for people, places, and then have patience. And what you're talking about is find those people and find those places and know and be able to communicate that. So how do students do that in their applications? How do they do that? Through their activities list, through their resumes, through their recommendations? They have all these floating pieces to an application, and particularly at a highly competitive college. So what are your recommendations for students in that regard?
Sure. So what we just talked about, I really see as sort of the pre-research phase of applications. It's not the applying, it's really honing in on your school list and your major and making sure you have the right fit. Now, in my experience, the best anchor for an application is the major itself. I generally do not recommend that students apply undecided because it's very difficult to give a narrative when you don't have a central narrative to share about your academic goals at the college. So I always advise, if somebody's not sure about their major, that they should pick the best fit major that aligns with their current demonstrated strengths and minimizes any potential weaknesses they have. Like if they have B's in math and A's in English, they would go with, maybe humanities major over a business major, right? For example, I have a student now, he's a wonderful young man, and he says, I want to be a doctor. And I said, well, of course you should be a doctor if you want to be a doctor. But right now we don't want to have you apply as a biology major because you have B's in your science classes and you have A's in these other classes. You won't be as compelling of an applicant. So in the application phase, you really have to find the best fit major that maximizes your strengths and really plays to those strengths. I also recommend, if it's possible, and it's not always possible, that if students are not sure about the major, that they choose one that is less popular. So any major that, like let's say like business and engineering, those are two of the majors that I hear most frequently among, clients and potential clients that want to work with me. Oh, I want to be a business major. And it's not that it's, they just haven't heard of other majors before, right? So there's no like anthropology class in high school. So they don't know about this stuff. So I think as counselors, consultants, we can help our kids to understand what are some of these interesting majors that have an interdisciplinary focus, and how might students leverage the different experiences they've had in these different realms that would really coalesce in one major. So I've found for a lot of students, the anthropology major can be a really good umbrella because it has biological ties, it has medical ties, it has linguistic ties. But there are a lot of majors out there that are like that because they are multi or interdisciplinary. So I think, as the applicant, the best thing you can do is pick a major that really leverages your strengths and can speak to the different sides of you and coalesce your whole narrative around that. And then when you get to college, you know that you can change the major. No one's going to be pulling up your application. The academic advising office does not have access to your application and what you said your major was going to be. They're not going to say like, well, you said you're going to be an anthropology major and now you're telling me you want to register for a bunch of biology classes. Like, no, you can't do that. They're not going to say that. Asterisk, some programs like engineering programs and like the program I attended as an undergrad, they are seated programs. So it's not that easy to change majors. But for the vast majority of majors, they are changeable. So definitely important to just double check to see if there is an ability to change before you have your student apply. But, for an anthropology major, history major, a cognitive science major, very often those are majors where you have a lot of freedom and flexibility that if you get in for one major, you don't have to graduate with that major.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that answers the other question of like, do they have to have a major coming in? Like as part of their authentic selves, if they're showing an interest or doing research, it has to be in a certain area. But it sounds like what you're saying is that's good, but they can pick something that's based on their interest if they haven't formulated exactly what major they want to do.
Exactly. And I mean, in my view, part of gaining that experience to be ready for college is to learn about different majors. So it's part of the preparation before you apply. So, don't just stick with, English, history, science, and foreign language, because those are the things that you take in school, but, really look at these majors where you haven't had any exposure yet. And then if you can do something over the summer or during the year, even if it's just a Coursera course or an edX course, and these classes are free, by the way, if you don't want to pay for their certificate, and the certificates are pretty low cost if you did want a certificate. Students can demonstrate curiosity and experience in these majors in an explicit and logical way if they do really want to get deeper in without, just kind of reading like, oh, what is this all about and how does this coalesce? There's a lot, and people don't necessarily realize that, like this is a job market vernacular, that they have transferable skills that may have been in one area, but they actually apply to many different other areas. So I would say for students and counselors, like to get creative and curious about like what are the possible directions beyond what's being presented to you, by the student. So the student is saying they want to be a biology major, but should they necessarily apply as that? Is that necessarily the best fit for them and the best choice given, the dynamics of admissions?
Right. So the major is a big part of it on their applications in terms of what they're putting down. What else on an application? What else do you see as being fundamental as part of communicating who they are and not falling into that impressiveness paradox?
Mm-hmm. Right. So part of having good application is also, knowing what you want to do and then also conveying that to your recommenders. I know we touched on briefly recommenders. So you need to make sure that the recommenders know what you're doing for your strategy, because if you've been talking to them all about biology, but then you decide to apply for anthropology, an admissions officer reads that, it's going to be kind of confusing for that person. And they're like, but wait, they said they wanted this, and then this person is saying that. And so that was one of the ways I saw, applications fall short in admissions, is that the recommenders just simply were writing a different angle or different narrative from what the students were actually conveying. So I think that those papers that the teachers send out to the students to have them fill in are super important, and they need to be filled out carefully in line with what the intended academic pathway is, so that those corroborate or confirm what the student is saying. The other piece, of course, is the extracurricular activity list. The Common App, as you know, doesn't provide very much room, and so in that space, it has to be as specific and metric space as possible, so that if you read one bullet point, you would have the essence of that activity in a very, very short space. So not being casual about that, and just making sure that it's very much focused on impact, the student's role and their impact in that organization. That's what you want to underline in that section. And then I always encourage students to have a resume, because it does provide more room and links and so on. The additional information section can also be a great resource for students to put in a research abstract, for example, or just other things that did not fit in with the other application pieces that in the spaces provided. And then, of course, the personal statement. And I think that's become more and more important with test optional admissions. It's really, really important for students to speak very personally and candidly about themselves. And for me, the personal statement is a character demonstrating essay. So this is not a, expanded resume, but something that really helps admissions to infer like what your I know I'm not telling you anything you don't know, Cyndy. You know all this. What your contribution.
No, we all need to hear it. Yeah. And the thing is, Aviva, we tell, as counselors and advisors, we tell our students, but when we have somebody else like yourself who is saying, here's what's important. You've been in those committees, you know what people are looking for. That has such an impact. So yeah, so go on, talk.
Yeah, great. So, the essay is ideally a character demonstrating essay that will help admissions to infer what the student's contribution will be. So, you remember a few years ago, there was that essay going around about the girl in Costco, and she was, looking at all the different things. And so, what I liked about that essay was that it just showed her that she was a multifaceted, multidisciplinary kind of thinker. And that's again, it's all about getting into the mindset of the college, oh, we love that, because that's what we value, right? So a lot of writing a good essay is really just putting yourself in the college's shoes and just saying well, what kind of story would they find fascinating? And I know we all have had, in high school and beyond, we've all had our own small and large sad things that have happened that have impacted us, but that's not necessarily the appropriate topic for the admissions essay. If it's not going to be an essay that contributes to their understanding of your character and your contribution to the university. So whenever you're writing your essay, you always want to ask, why would this story be important to admissions? What would they think based on what they're looking for? What would they think about this story? What would somebody take away from this story? So that's a really important question to ask before you, kind of write out, whatever is on your mind. And it's a hard exercise for kids, because a lot of kids don't realize it. They're used to writing, book reports and small projects for class, and they don't realize that this is a different exercise. Right. So an essay that worked well in English may not work well in this context.
Yeah, that's very true. Well, and that connects back to what you were saying in the beginning about, what is the college's mission? What is their strategic plan? And then in the personal statement, if you have those experience or things that you're going to bring, to make sure you highlight them in your personal statement. And it also sounds like one of the things that I hear a lot of college admissions officers talk about is continuity. And, as you were saying, well, if they're mentioning one thing on their application, one major, and the recommenders don't know that, then there's a disconnect. And so having some continuity and having that story of show up in their activities and their recommendations, in their personal statement, that creates that continuity. Does that help alleviate that impressiveness paradox?
Well, I think it's two things, right? So I think that, the continuity, the messaging of the application is sort of its own bucket of okay, now I've done what I'm going to do. How do I sort of package myself in the best way for this college? And then in terms of the impressiveness paradox, that's all about the choices that we make leading up to the application, right? So how are we looking to make an impact on our school, on our communities, ahead of where we're applying, how is that informing our goals? So it contributes to our self-understanding if we can avoid the impressiveness paradox and focus on the things that we like to do and focus on doing them to the best of our ability. That's how you put yourself into the position to be the most competitive applicant for whatever colleges that you want to apply to. But when you're in the application phase, it's really important to figure out, like, what are the colleges that are actually going to value the things that I've done? And then how do I talk to those people?
Okay. Yeah, that makes a clear distinction. I know a lot, I've worked with the AVID program for 14 years. And so I would tell my students, and no matter what program they're in, if they're involved in, a particular kind of program or something, it's like, you spend all this time in it. If you don't talk about it, they're not going to think that it's important to you. So if it's an important thing to you, you should talk about it in your essay. Because it's going to come up in everything else. It's on your transcript. It's all, so it's going to look funny if you don't mention it somewhere. So, it's looking at their overall picture and what's that picture look like. So how do you help parents? Managing expectations is a big part of what we do as college advisors. Parents come in with these different expectations, and how do you help? What's your advice to parents and students who are focused on a very narrow list of schools and say, here's the top 10 or 20 that I need to apply to? How do you recommend, or what advice do you give them to help them broaden their perspective and go from that perspective that you're advocating?
I mean, that's a great question. I think, one of the questions I like to ask, like, I had a student I was meeting with yesterday about her college list, and it was very top heavy, as many lists are, right? I all want, certain schools, right?
The ones that are on the wall behind you.
Exactly.
Denver, Princeton, and Yale.
Exactly. Well, so, I mean, in essence, a lot of it is just probing into like the more deep aspects of why they want these things. I know they might just say it's brand name or it's the ranking. That's a typical answer, but like, getting beyond that, what would this mean to you to go there? What would you hope to fulfill if you were going there? So give them some assignments to research these colleges and make notes about what they like and what they don't like. And I would say encourage them to talk to people at these colleges too, to really understand what these colleges are all about. So what I find is, like, even though I agree with the principle of, hey, people should diversify their lists, the reality is I know a lot of people are not there mentally. And so it's really just about helping them think through their choices and come up with options that are perhaps more, tangible or easier to get into based on the things that they most value in these more elite colleges. And at least getting them to feel comfortable with their alternate options in the event that their first choices don't work out. So I don't necessarily tend to dissuade people from that way of thinking in an explicit way, but I just try to unpack their logic a little bit more, because I think everybody has a different sort of set of things that they're thinking about in this. I mean, for some kids, it's like, I know for some of my kids, I don't know about you, but they're maybe not very good at computer science, but something is like driving them to computer science. I find this is true with my Bay Area and my Seattle kids. It's like, it's like tech is in the air and they just feel like they have to weave it in some way. And so a lot of times it's just like unpacking that of like, okay, what would it mean to you to have tech? Does that need to happen in order for you to feel comfortable with this list, right? Whatever that is. So it's really hard. And I think that, again, the test optional piece has really just made things a lot more complicated for most kids. I definitely acknowledge it's created opportunity in certain ways for underrepresented kids who maybe wouldn't have had a chance to apply or be accepted to these colleges. But for so many applicants, it's just really, really hard for them to just figure out, like, well, what is a reach school at this point? What is a target school? Because there's just, the acceptance rates are so low at everywhere, that how do you even make that choice, right? So I think as college counselors, that's a really challenging question for us to navigate, is like, how do we redefine what is a target? What is a reach? What is a safety in this new paradigm, right? So yeah, it's a tough question, but I think, every family has to be approached delicately. And I wouldn't want to tell somebody like, don't don't dream big, because I think part of going to college is like that inspiration of having dreams and hopes for your future. But it's just maybe being more realistic about certain aspects of it, breaking it down more.
Well, and I think that's where our professionalism comes in, is knowing, where, and in working with the families to understand what's driving them, and what's truly behind the motivation, and what are they looking for, and then helping them see that they can, if it's connections or networking or, a better job, whatever that is, to be able to find that somewhere. So we have a number of questions, both in the question and answer, and also in the chat. And I'll remind my listeners, if you do have a question, go ahead and put it in the question and answer. I don't have Carmen with me today. She was not able to join us. And then that way, if we don't get to your question, we'll know who to send the answer to afterwards as well. So, but we're going to talk about some of the things that have come up in the chat. And I've also put a link to your book, from Amazon. If there's another link you would rather us use, we can put that in as well.
Thanks. If you go to getreal.com, it has all the different retailers that you can purchase from, in case you prefer not to buy from Amazon.
Okay, so Get Real. Oops.
Yeah.
And
just a quick way to just find the book.
Okay. Well, that is not working. All right, somebody else can put it in for me. So how do students, let's go to Honorata. She says, I have an international student who insists on writing about academics. How do I persuade him to write about himself or other aspects of his life?
Yeah, that's really hard. I mean, I think our profession is so interesting, because it's not like we're just advising the student. We're also navigating the relationship with the parent, the student's relationship with the parent, their involvement in the process, and then the ways in which the parent is interacting with us too. So I think it's a complicated question that requires more than a simple answer. I think that the best thing to lean on are your own experiences, the cases of people you've worked with who have, had outcomes that this student is hoping for, and what they've talked about, to encourage them to think a little bit more about, other aspects, right? Because I know in certain, I've worked with Chinese kids from China before, and at Chinese high schools, the traditional high schools, they don't have extracurricular activities. So it's like not even like a thing, right? So it's kind of a Western thing to even be thinking about this sort of thing. And some kids just don't have time. They go to school for 12 hours a day. So I think, it's helpful to know, like, what are their constraints? Like, why are they not talking about extracurriculars? Is it just they don't have time because their academics are too demanding? Is it that their parents are telling them not to do any extracurricular activities? It's just they don't see the value of the extracurricular activities. So sometimes it's just like, if they're from abroad, it's just helping them understand, like, this is what they value in Western culture. So, this is why I'm asking you this, because this is what they're going to be looking for on the application. I want to help you to express yourself, or to draw that out from you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's, well, yeah. And that goes back to also helping families and parents to manage those expectations, which, and that's another one of the questions is, what about, let's see where I've got it here. Okay. Parents who are looking for that name brand and that prestige, that she says her students get it, but the parents sometimes do not. Oh, what Claire did. What do you say to parents who are brand prestige oriented? My students get what you're saying, but the students are worried about disappointing their parents or disagreeing with them.
Right. Yeah, it's hard. I mean, I think it's important to involve the parents. And when I first started practicing, I did not involve the parents as much as I should have. And since I've involved the parents more, I think that the process has gone a lot better. So I don't know the ways in which different folks are involving parents. Every month with parents, I send like a check-in, like, how are you doing? How are you feeling? And then if they tell me they're feeling stressed, I make sure to get on the call with them and find out what's going on. So a lot of it is just like finding out what those expectations are and working with them. And, the truth is once the kid is out of the house, like they can kind of, once they're in the college, right, there's some degree of freedom that they're going to have to make choices. So it might be just finding a choice that's comfortable for the whole family in the moment. And then, knowing that it's a choice that if the student wants to change directions when they get to college, they can do that. Like rather than, let's say, funneling them into an engineering program, then maybe you funnel them into a science program where they can switch to, psychology or something different, right, when they get there. So helping them to keep their options open. So that way, if there is a conflict or a mismatch, you can say, well, we can go with this, but, this will give, little Johnny or whoever the flexibility to, to do something else if that makes sense. And then also I think relying on your experience of like what works well for this kind of applicant with this kind of profile. I think that goes a long way. If they're hiring you as the expert, then, I think that you should share, like, nobody can know everything, but what you know about the process and what's worked for your kids and what's worked in your practice. And I think that a lot of us, I'll just say, especially the women, like we often belittle our own expertise without meaning to. And we need to kind of own what we know and be firm in what we know so that people will pay attention and respond to what we're saying.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's one of the messages I have for my students in my UCLA class and other consultants is, you do know you're the expert, you're the professional, and you may not know everything, but you know more, and you're the one that's going to help them approach it and manage it. And so owning that and using that as a part of your messaging can be very powerful for sure. So how do you help? Where do you recommend? There's no like one place. You mentioned the Chronicle of Philanthropy. So you can go there and say, okay, here are all the different colleges that have received, grants and things, but there's no one place to go and look up mission statements or things like that. So how do you, Katie's asking, how to find students sort through and find all of the schools available that appeal to their personal expertise or passion.
Right. Well, in my book, I do have an exercise that just simply helps you narrow down by some simple criteria of like what's your biggest priority? Is it location? Is it brand name? So at least getting a sense of like what the priorities are will help narrow the list. A tool I like to use if the school has it available, and again, I'm probably not saying anything that many of you don't know. If you have access to your kids' Naviance or Cialfo or whatever they're using at their high school, that will help you as the consultant or counselor to understand the band of typical range performance for the kid that you're helping versus the pool. Because when colleges look at applicants, most colleges look at them by high school. So whatever kid you're helping is going to be competing with other kids from the same high school. So knowing where your kid sits relative to those other kids is really useful for kind of initial, not to say it has to drive the whole list, but it's a huge part, the feeder, this idea of having feeder schools, a feeder school essentially meaning a high school that feeds a lot of kids into one or more colleges. So where I grew up, this is a huge anomaly, where I, as I said, I moved to Princeton. I was a high school kid when I moved, so I did not grow up there, but my class was 275 people, 22 people were going to Princeton. That is like ridiculous and not true for every high school, right? Because, we were located in the same town. A lot of kids had their professors, a lot of kids have professors or kids who knew professors, kids who took classes at the university, if they excelled or exceeded the requirements at the high school. So there were a lot of chances for kids to connect, right? And then, but for other colleges, like, nobody would get in or one person would get in. And so it's like the same person would be seen as more attractive to some universities just simply by this feeder relationship. And so one of the big drivers in this application process, which has nothing to do with the kid, is the relationship between the high school counselor or the high school in general and the colleges themselves. Because if the colleges know you, the colleges are visiting your high schools, your child's or your client's high schools, then that suggests that they're actually looking to recruit people from that high school versus a college that's never visited the high school before. Then, they may not know the high school or have a connection with the high school or care much about what happens to the applicants at that high school. So that's a huge part of helping kids, is just understanding what are those connections, what are those feeder relationships. So that's a big way to narrow, because there's like thousands and thousands of colleges out there. They can't apply to all of them, right? So
Right.
that's a really helpful way to narrow it down. And you'll find that there are hundreds of colleges that any given high school has had applicants apply to, and you can get some insight on that and then build a list from there.
And I think that makes a lot of sense. And again, it identifies and highlights one of the biggest myths out there. I just finished reading Jeffrey Salingo's book too, and reading that and reading yours at the same time, especially that whole concept of the high schools matter really stood out in his book as well, and what you're talking about. And so many of us, like in my area, we don't have Harvard and Yale and Cornell come visit high schools in this area. I mean, I remember having a conversation with an admissions representative at Notre Dame a few years ago. And I said, well, how are you going to know how my student compares to other students at their high school? She said, oh, well, we'll see that on the profile. Like, not all high schools have a profile. It's like, oh yeah, they all have profiles. No, not all the high schools in my area have profiles. I had to go in and have my high school create a profile when my children were applying to college, because nobody had ever asked them for that before. So, it does it's not a total meritocracy of admissions. Do all the best things you can as a student and you'll be just as admissible as everybody else. It is not a meritocracy at all. And that's a huge shock to a lot of people, right?
Exactly. And people, self-assess, whether accurately or inaccurately, but the self-assessment is useless without the context of, like, here's the history of who's gotten in from your high school, how many people have gone. I mean, it's in some ways disheartening, but if you know the information, it can be empowering, because you don't want to just send applications all over the place if you have no idea about that, because that's a waste of your time and energy. You want to really focus on the institutions that are the best fit and you have the best chance of getting into. And not to say if the college has never picked somebody from your high school that you couldn't be the first one, but you're going to have to do a lot more legwork on your side to network with that college, to like get them to know you, because otherwise they're going to be like, what is this high school in the middle of nowhere that I've never heard of? And how do I evaluate this transcript? It's just all A's against someone else. So it's really hard. I mean, there's a lot of pieces to this. And what my book really focuses on is, not obviously that stuff matters, but if as a student, you're really maximizing your opportunities in high school, you can figure all these like mechanics out of admissions, right? But if you're doing your best work, you're going to be the most attractive candidate to the colleges where you will be a strong candidate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I loved how you have stories in there in the book about different people and their journeys. And you have the worksheets, as you've referenced, helping the students to explore that and to dig a little deeper. And it's very helpful to have those kind of resources. So Lisa had asked, and I'm going back to the questions now, and trying to do them from the first ones he asked to more recent ones. So we're going to be going back into our conversation. But you talked about making personal connections. So Lisa says, I've heard conflicting info about reaching out to admission rep versus not bothering them. And she says, I got an email from an admissions rep who covers my state, said, reach out anytime. Do I take them at their word, or where's the line? You don't want to pester them. So we're talking you don't want to look like you're brown nosing them or, doing it just for demonstrated interest. So what is your recommendation?
Right. So I guess there are kind of two things I'm hearing here. So one, I'm hearing, I don't know if this is the question, but about college counselors reaching out to admissions officers. So I didn't know if that was the angle of the question versus like the student. Do you have a sense of which way the person is asking it?
More from the counselor.
Right. I mean, everybody has a different viewpoint on this. I think that, in I guess in my practice, I'm really big on confidentiality, and that I'm on the team of the student and the family. Like, I'm not on the college's team when I'm in a working relationship. So if I'm reaching out to the college on students' behalf, it has to have a specific, that family has to have asked me to reach out to find out information on their behalf or something like that. I would not just reach out and be like, you know, Johnny Mac is applying, and I had some questions for you. Like, I wouldn't call the college unsolicited on behalf of my student without a purpose. I don't think that college counselors help their students by reaching out to admissions. I think that admissions is there as like a resource if you have questions about the process. In terms of student outreach, though, I think that the outreach to admissions officers can be positive, but I think it should be limited to polite introductions, sharing your resume, expressing your early interest in applying, and not asking those admissions officers specific questions, because admissions officers are essentially the salespeople of the university. Like, they know about the product of the university, of generally like, here are the benefits, here are all the resources we have, but they don't necessarily know what your specific student would like. And so that's why I recommended my outreach strategy of professors, alumni, students, resource centers like cultural centers, academic departments. That is a better strategy for admissions, because then you're going to get specific examples pertinent to your situation as in student situation, versus just like saying like, hey, I'm over here, like I'm applying, I think that's fine to do on a limited basis, but it's not as helpful as getting that nuance and color that you can get through these other kinds of interactions.
True, true. And that makes sense, because then that broadens their connections, and then that shows their authenticity even more. I reached out to this department, this professor in this department, or, found out about this, institute at the university. I want to learn more and things like that. So that makes sense. So what about, let's see. I pointed out your banners behind you.
Oh yeah, I saw that.
So what about, do you have a more diverse group of
yeah, I
college
appreciate
banners?
that. Look, I've heard that feedback too. I think here's the real truth. Here's real talk. So one, I just had a baby a few months ago. This room is tiny. It has a changing table in it. There's like literally no more room for me to hang banners other than the ones I have right now. And I'm moving. And I'm moving at the end of this month. So that's reason one. Reason two is like, no one saw this book till this week. My practice is focused on helping achievement-oriented people. This is what achievement-oriented people like to see. So this is why this is up here. So this is like a marketing tool, not a belief system, I would say. But also, like, I have other people have said that, and I have thought about that. And I was like, and my husband's the one who hung this. And I was like, honey, I'd like to get more banners. And he's like, not till the new house. And I'm like, all right, he's the one who hangs them, so I gotta wait.
Yeah. And I think that's well spoken too. We as counselors have lives, and things come into play, and that's very, very key as well. So what about ED? We haven't talked about ED. We have just a few more minutes, but so Lisa's asking about strategies about ED, especially you mentioned the test optional and how much that's, made this much more of a pressure cooker for a lot of students. So, do you encourage ED to improve the odds, even if the student is interested in multiple schools? This is
it's a great question. It's such a hard one. I think that if the ED option makes sense for the child, like, okay, if they are just totally sold on one college, they have an ED policy, and that student would feel comfortable if they got in, and they would be comfortable going and not weighing other options. And I think ED is an awesome strategy. I would definitely recommend it if it's feasible. But if somebody would have, as I say, FOMO, fear of missing out, or just have regrets of some way, if they got in, they couldn't weigh other options, I think it's a terrible idea. So I think in general, from an odds standpoint, it's a great idea, but there's a lot more nuance to this decision than just odds. And a lot of people just like to look at the odds and make decisions on that, but that's not a good idea. But I think in this climate, though, I think people do really have to weigh this. Is this a good strategy for them? Given the landscape that we have, and if they can make it work, and financially and philosophically and everything else, then I think it's a great thing to do.
And that's the thing too, is the the financial too, right? Mm-hmm. And if they can make it financially, that's a big part of it as well. So, and it goes to show that, especially in our profession, there is no clear-cut answer. It's, so often the answer is, it depends, right? Depends on the student, depends on the college, it depends on all these different things. And that's why we have jobs as college advisors, we're the professionals that help kind of navigate through all of that. So Sean is asking, if students from our high school have been admitted but haven't attended, does that hurt a future applicant? Going back to the conversation about high school.
It depends. It can potentially hurt if, there's a history of like, oh, the college really likes these kids, but these kids don't like the college, because the colleges are ultimately trying to manage their yield, which, as most of you probably know, it's, the proportion of accepted students to enrolled students. And they want that percentage to be higher because it plays into rankings, it plays into their, planning for housing and things like that. So, if they don't feel fairly confident that someone will come, they may not want to take them. So that's where I think the student has some ownership and influence over their own outreach and the ways that they demonstrate interest through, visits, special relationships that they build outside of the application process, to help influence it in some way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the colleges don't want to feel like they're the second choice or the fallback.
The backup, right? Yeah, exactly.
Right. So talking about the recommendation or the optional resume. So you mentioned that they should submit a resume if they can. Do you have, Ellen's asking if you have a page limit that you recommend? Is it,
That's a great question. It's funny, and I've spoken with different people, but I've seen like 7-page resumes that have been awesome. And I've seen 2-page resumes that have been great too. I think 1 page can sometimes be too short, to be honest, because if it's just 1 page, you're probably just getting about 1 bullet point per thing anyway, which is what you're doing on the Common App activity list. So I'd say, I wouldn't necessarily recommend 7 pages, but I've had kids get into top schools with really long resumes. So I don't believe in a limit. I think that it needs to capture, it can't be just extra fluff, right? Everything has to count, but I wouldn't artificially adjust the content based on an arbitrary page limit.
Okay. Well, that's good to know, because so often, from a business or, when you're applying for a job, they're like no more than 2 pages. And, so that's good to hear. So a couple of people are asking about the unpacking the computer science major idea. And Karen's saying, I like to build, can you also talk about unpacking the engineering major? I like to build things from Legos. I want to be an engineer. Like, what does that really look like or sound like?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I think that's a very long conversation about like the type of engineering, whether it's mechanical, computer, electrical, environmental, and like what has been the demonstrated experience. So is there research? Is it, is it hands-on kind of more hardware or software? And so, yeah, I think there's a lot to unpack there, but the important thing is whatever major is chosen, there has to be demonstrated experience today, not just future interests, but evidence, tangible things that the student could talk about that would directly relate to those goals.
Okay. Yeah. So again, just showing what I've done and why it's interests me, and, and how, especially for engineering, it's like, why have I been an engineer at heart, all my life type of thing. Mm-hmm. So we're out of time. I have 2 more questions. One I'm going to save for the last, but with COVID now, we're still going through the effects of COVID. Many students in some areas still haven't been able to get out and do a lot. So what is your recommendation for students who are trying to this is Mindy's question, to get research experience, but they still can't get into labs because of COVID. She says, I have a student that's been doing literature review for a lab all summer, and a professor is telling her she still can't come into the lab in the fall, even though she's fully vaccinated. So how is COVID impacting this?
Yeah, that's really hard with the lab question. I think, for all of us and, this child particularly, she sounds like she's doing the best she can to get this experience, given that she can't come into the lab. I think, whatever we do, and this is highlighted in the book too, is just about making the best of the situations that we have. So some of the stories I share in the book are kind of sad, like people experiencing tragedies or difficulties. And, the message behind all of them is that, they had these problems, but they kind of made the best of whatever the situation was. And so that's my advice to anybody. We're all going through this hard time together, and it's impacting all of us differently, but we want to make the best of our circumstances given what our constraints and opportunities are.
And I think that is very much going to be the message this year too, is they have to look, everybody's experiencing COVID, right? And they have to expand a little bit beyond that and dig into, well, how has it specifically helped you or, impeded you, or how did you, like with the lab question, like, here's what I've tried to do and here's what I've done instead. And, and here's my map. It's not going to be held against them.
Right.
It's not going to be held against them. They weren't able to go take the test or whatever, do an in-person volunteer. So 2 more questions as we finish up. Well, how do people learn more? You mentioned your website. Is there more information? So talk about your website.
So go to getrealandgetin.com. If you haven't bought the book, you can find it at different retailers. If you have bought the book and you want to check out some bonus material, there's a place you can put your email in there, and I will send you, the system will send you reflection exercises from the book, and then also some bonus stories that I unfortunately couldn't fit into the book. So you can check that out. My work is on that website too, my consulting work. So if you want to learn more about that, you can do that there. Otherwise you can find me on LinkedIn, Facebook, at Aviva Legatt. So invite you to connect with me if you want to stay in touch.
And are you doing speaking engagements as well, Aviva?
Well, next week I have a LinkedIn Live coming up with Jeff Salingo. So I'm excited about that. It's on Thursday at noon. And I'm taking different podcast interviews, and just with the COVID, between the COVID situation and having a baby recently, I haven't been as focused on traveling for speaking, but I am hoping to, continue to get the message out about the book and what I would hope that people get out of it in all different ways that I can.
Well, that's great. I'm glad that you're going to be able to do all of that. So as we're closing, I want to see who recognizes where I am at today. And whoever tells me where I'm at, the very first person, we're going to you're going to get a free copy of Aviva's book. See, I have my version here, and we're going to give 2 other free books out. So let's see where people think I am. So we've got Sedona, Arizona, Fort Myers. Nope, not yet. Keep going. Let's see who else knows where I'm at. Tahoe, nope. It looks like Castle Rock, but no, that's not Utah. Dale, you're going to have to expand on that. Dale was the first one. It's not Central California. Lisa is right. So who can tell me what college this is that I'm at? Colorado School of Mines. Absolutely. The famous Tabletop Mountain. There's no tabletop in South Tabletop. I'm from Golden, so I just got to visit this the last week. So Dale, congratulations. Please send me an email, and then we'll get the book to you. Lisa, you came in second, so we'll do that for you too. And then I'll do a drawing, and everybody else that joined us today, thank you very much. Aviva, thank you. This has just been so delightful to be able to talk to you and have people ask all these questions, and they will learn so much from your book and everything that you've done. So
Thank you so much for having me, Cyndy. It's great to chat with you and connect with all the counselors and consultants on the line. I really appreciate it.
Okay. All right. Everybody have a great weekend. Join me next week. We're going to have a special Friday forum. I'm trying to do them on the first and the third Fridays of each month, but the Supreme Court just came out with a ruling on college athletes and using their name and their image. So Katie Anderson is going to join me, and she's got a special presentation she's going to do on that. So if you have athletes, you're wondering how this affects them, please join me next Friday. Registration is already up on my website at cindymcdonald.com. And remember, Cyndy spelled with 2 Y's, so it's CYNDY, McDonald.com, and you can register for it on my website. So Aviva, thank you again. Thank you everyone for being here. Have a great weekend, okay?